Hey everybody, this is Pete Bartolozzi welcoming you to another broadcast. As you can see, we're going to continue with Daniel Revelation now. Obviously, just still in the beginnings of Daniel, taking a look at the visions of chapter 7 and chapter 8 simultaneously, since again, the chapter 8, it says that it corresponds with the first one, and we're seeing how they correspond. We've already been through because it's talked about in the beginning of chapter 7, how the winds blew upon the great sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and these beasts begin to rise up out of the sea. And we've already been through the first three beasts and have begun. And of course, the first beast was Babylon. The second beast was the Medo-Persian Empire. The third was Greece. And now here in the fourth, we're beginning to see, we're seeing the Roman Empire. These are all the kingdoms that had to do with those who had control over Israel. It's the center of the prophecies right there on the very edge of the Mediterranean Sea. And so I want to continue now. We were looking at the fourth beast in chapter 7, and the first part of verse 7. We read this, and it said, "And after this, I continued watching in these night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible and exceeding strong, and it had huge iron teeth, and it destroyed and crushed and trampled underfoot what remained, and it was different from all the beasts that preceded it." And of course, this corresponds with Nebuchadnezzar's dream and in the interpretation of chapter 2, verse 4 or 40, and the fourth kingdom will be strong as iron, just as iron breaks and crushes everything, and the iron it shatters all these, it will break and crush. And of course, the iron teeth of this beast ties in with the iron legs of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And we talked about the Roman Empire. The Tanakh had notes on it as well. This is already history to us. It was futuristic to Daniel, but it was all history to us. This is stuff that's already taken place, and so on, and how vast the kingdom became and how long it lasted. Then at the very last of verse 7, it just makes this simple phrase, and it says, "And it had 10 horns." Now, at this time, it isn't fully revealing this, but as we continue on in prophecy, we'll begin to see that there's a gap of time between the legs and the feet with the 10 toes, because you'll see as prophecy goes on, it defines the feet and the toes separately than it does the legs. Same kingdom, but it defines himself. There's a separation there, and that separation, of course, is what we refer to as the age of grace. This time that Jesus started, we'll see later, there's this gap between the 69th and 70th week of Daniel's prophecies. And so these 10 horns correspond to the 10 toes of Nebuchadnezzar's statue. It's going from the legs to the feet. It flows from one to the other, because they are of the same system of government. It was not revealed here about the gap between the feet and the legs, between the original Roman Empire, and what many in prophecy are calling the revised Roman Empire. So which would be the feet. So it just flows from one to the other as though it was all of the same kingdom during the same period of time, or happening consecutively. Excuse me, my throat's a little dry. Seeing what these 10 horns refers to, we now know in end of days prophecy, they refer to the 7-year tribulation period. And again, remember, horns in biblical prophecy refer to leaders. So we do know, that's why people talk about these 10 leaders. And based on the idea of being 10 leaders, we've preached 10 nations. But that has actually given us a wrong perspective, and we'll talk about that later, not now. But just kind of stick that thought on a shelf, and we'll get to it. Because there will literally be more than 10 nations that we presently acknowledge that will be a part of this. But I can help explain that as time when we get to that point. He goes on, then in verse 8 of chapter 7 still, where he's initially getting the vision. And he says, "As I was contemplating the 10 horns, behold, from among the 10 horns there rose up a little horn, and 3 of the previous horns were uprooted before it. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Now, again, it's not fully revealed in here, but out of those 10 horns will rise up a little horn. Okay, this is transitioned over the age of grace from the original system of government of the Roman Empire to the revising of that governmental system. Again, as some call the revised Roman Empire, it's the revising of the system of government. And we'll see why Satan does that later, but not at this time. So I want to bring it out in Scripture as we go along. And so the little horn that comes up at the 10 is the Antichrist. Now, it's not fully revealed. I know I'm kind of bringing some things out here, but as we go along in biblical prophecy, I'll keep bringing up with the information about this little horn. And this little horn, I want you to notice that horns always represent leaders. So a little, and he called it a little horn. He called Alexander the Great a great horn. But he called this end-time Antichrist a little horn. Man, I'll tell you what, folks, we try to build up this Antichrist to be so. Now, he will accomplish great things through his oratory deception, as we'll see, and accomplish some great things. But when it comes to the fullness of the end of what he's going to accomplish, he's a little horn. Quit trying to build him up greater than the Bible tries to build him up as. Quit trying to make him bigger than God actually describes him in prophecy, in revealing these things that he knows of the future. He's a little horn. And we need to keep that in mind. He's nothing more than a little horn. And it says that this horn had the eyes of a man and a mouth speaking great things. This is the beginning of him revealing of him being a great orator. And being very bold in his speech, obviously, and speaking great things. This word great things is again the word rob, which was the word used to describe the immensity of the statue of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And so when he may be a little horn, but he's going to speak rob. He's going to speak great, immense things that are huge in size or domineering in character. Figuratively, trying to speak great and things bigger, obviously, than he is, because he's described as a little horn. He's going to speak things that are so much past what he really is. So that's what this reveals to us. And the Stone edition of my Tanakh translates it, a mouth speaking haughty words. And then now I want to take a look at this in chapter 8, how it compares to chapter 8. And in his vision, beginning in verse 9, it says, "Therefore the he-goat, which was Greece, became great, and when he was mighty, the great horn was broken, and 4 notable ones came up in his place toward the 4 winds of heaven." We read that already. And then in verse 9 it says, "Out of them came forth a little horn." This is the same little horn, which became very great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. Now the little horn here corresponds with the little horn of chapter 7. The little horn is he who we commonly refer to as the Antichrist of the Great Tribulation. Now, in chapter 7, it speaks of the little horn coming out of the revised Roman Empire. And here it speaks of him coming out of the Grecian Empire, and that can sound confusing. So which is it? Well, the Roman Empire engulfed the Greek Empire. So this tells us that even though he would rise out of the Roman Empire revised, this also tells us at least his ancestry comes out of the area of the Greek Empire. The Grecian Empire was engulfed again by the Roman Empire. Billy Brim stated this, and she edited a book for Dr. Hilton Sutton. And she said in her outline of Daniel, and speaks of editing, of course, Dr. Hilton Sutton's book, or excuse me, not Dr. Hilton Sutton, forgive me, Dr. Lester Sumrall, edited a book for Dr. Lester Sumrall. And when I was editing the book for Lester Sumrall, we talked about this. And since I knew that Dr. Sumrall thought the revised Roman Empire headed up in Europe would be the platform off which the Antichrist would rule, I asked him, how then could he be Middle Eastern? In his own imitable way, he answered, "Don't you know that men of destiny gravitate to the regions of power in their time? The people may not even know he's Middle Eastern in origin." And then she reads an article. She said, many years ago, I came across a set of Time Life books on the empires. There I found the answer. The books brought out that the Greek Empire left the biggest footprint on our society. So much that so much of what we have is of Greek origin. Philosophy, democracy, sport, Olympics, gymnasium, art, and the ideal of beauty, architecture, medicine, theater, biology, geography, epic and lyric poetry, tragedy and comedy, etc., etc. The Time Life book stated this: Rome brought little new. They promulgated Grecia. And so we see in Revelation 13:2 that where it reveals the body of this beast, or it reveals this beast, the conglomeration of beast, you find that the body of this beast, the largest part of this beast, is the leopard, representing Greece. So even though the Antichrist doesn't come up so much didn't come up in that time of the Grecian Empire, but in this end, because of the influence of that Greece being brought into the Roman Empire, is why it shows the little horn coming up out of Greece, because of the great influence that the Greek Empire had really over the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was more of a conquering them, and they brought some of their own things, but they promulgated Greece. If you look at Roman architecture, it's Greek. It's Greek in form. You look at everything that we just listed here, lyric and poet and all their philosophy. It was all the Greek philosophers, and so on. Socrates and Aristotle and all these were Greek, and Rome embraced all this stuff, and so it was more Grecian in origin, even in the Roman Empire, and that's why it reveals this. But this little horn comes up out of that final end time kingdom during the tribulation period that we call the kingdom of the Antichrist, that many refer to, because of seeing these biblical things, as the Roman Empire revised. And it's an empire, it's a revising of the system. It won't necessarily be Roman in name as it will be the system, but it has to come up in the same area, which we'll talk about later. Now, okay, what's the next thought here I want to bring out that's very good in this? He became very great, even though he's a little horn. Became very great because of his great oratory ability, speaking great words past what he really is. It did raise him up for a time and accomplish a lot of things that were great, but it ends up really falling apart in the end, as we'll see. But I want you to see something. It says, and out of it came forth a little horn, which became very great, toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land. Now, when we looked at the Medo-Persian Empire in prophecy, it described, again, the direction in which they moved. And it helped us to understand. We already know the direction they moved by history, okay? And so I'm going to look at this again real quick. When it talked about the Medo-Persian Empire, it said what? That this ram pushed west, north, and south. And they went over here into Egypt. Primary west, that's why it was the first one listed. They primarily moved west, but there was some north and there was some south. But that it helped us then to not only know the direction that they moved, but it helps us pinpoint where they started. It didn't say anything about going east, and they didn't go east. So it helped us to locate where he's coming from. We already know that from history. All right. So that's not the main point. Is you got to understand in biblical prophecy, it helps you to show in the direction they go, helps us to see where they begin. And I want you to notice now the prophetic earth again is the great sea. That's the background. That's the backdrop of all end time biblical prophecy. And it began with that. So it is concerning all end time biblical prophecy. So it's this area around the Mediterranean Sea of the European, Middle Eastern, North African area around the Mediterranean Sea. This is, then, again, what people call the prophetic earth, because this is the base of biblical prophecy. All right? So by seeing the direction they went, we can see where they began. I want you to notice the direction of this Antichrist in the final end time kingdom. It says he goes south and east, which tells us where he comes from when he conquers. He has to then, in this Mediterranean area, has to begin in this area for him to go south and for him to go east. This tells us the location then would be this European area. You see, it doesn't say anything about west. It doesn't say anything about north, which means the whole of this European area, and I will say minus England, and I'll show that in prophecy later. But the entirety of this main body of European area will have already come together so that when the Antichrist come to power, he doesn't have to do conquering up here. It's already come together. And so his movement in expansion goes south and east. It tells us where it begins. All right. Now, why am I emphasizing this? Because there are so many people today preaching that the 10 nations, the 10 horns, the 10 nations are just 10 Muslim nations, folks. And then they pull a prophecy or two here and there that supports their idea. But folks, anything that is truly biblical prophecy will embrace every single thing that biblical prophecy says and leave nothing out. Not one jot or tittle will go unfulfilled. Folks, this right here is the first thing that completely debunks that. And as far as I'm concerned, the only thing that is needed to debunk it, but I will show you more biblical prophecy that does that as well. But here's the biggest thing. If it were Muslim nations over here in the Middle East, then their progression then would be west and north, the two opposite of what it says, the direction that the Antichrist will go. You see that? So it cannot just be 10 Muslim nations. That is a lie that is being spread throughout Christianity and gets biblical end-time biblical prophecies completely off course. No matter how many certain prophecies make it sound like it supports their idea, it cannot and does not embrace them all. Therefore, it cannot be that. Now, I do believe, excuse me, carrying on like that, my throat was getting a little more dry again. And so you can see I'm very strong about this, very passionate about this. This is such a wrong teaching that it's just that. And so because of that, there's this argument about whether the Antichrist comes up in the eastern or western leg. And they're arguing, well, it's going to be the eastern leg because it comes up out of these Muslim countries. That's a lie. Okay? But the whole idea of a western-eastern leg is bogus, folks. Okay? And this is why. Because in Nebuchadnezzar's vision, it wasn't a one-legged statue. It was both legs, both feet, all 10 toes. The idea of Eastern-Western is bogus. It will have to engulf the entire earth to be 1/4 of the earth. Okay? Now you got to understand how the Bible uses the word earth. See, we use the word earth to represent the whole planet, the whole globe of the earth, the whole surface of the earth. That's how we use the term. But the Bible doesn't use it that way. When you just go back to creation, Genesis chapter 1, on the third day it says God called dry land to appear, and it says he called the dry land earth. He didn't say he called it the planet earth. So when it says 1/4 of the earth, it's talking about 1/4 of the dry land. And now we know that the earth is about 70% surface of it, 70% water. Now I'm using earth the way we commonly use it there, of course, as the whole planet. But 70% of the earth's surface, because of how we use it, or 70% of the world's surface is water. And so that means only about 30% of the world's surface, the earth's surface, is dry land, or earth as the Bible calls it. So it's only 1/4 of that 30%. That he will control. The only body of water that is considered a part of the prophetic earth is the body of water that is the background of all end-time prophecy, and that's the Mediterranean Sea, which is approximately 1 million square miles. And when you take the miles, the square miles of Europe, Middle East, North Africa, you come up with 1/4 of the earth, which literally is going to make this kingdom going to be even greater than the original Roman Empire, because the original Roman Empire really didn't conquer the Middle East. They had one sliver across this upper area that got into Iraq and Iran. That was the furthest they ever got into that area, which would include the area of the old ancient kingdom of Assyria. Not Syria, but Assyria. There were two different kingdoms. Okay? And but the direction tells us where he will begin, though, folks. It tells us where he'll begin. He will begin here in order to go south and east. And that's what it tells us right here, is plain as language, toward the south and toward the east, you see. So we know it's going to begin here. And folks, this is the thing. It's got to begin in Rome, or it is not the same beast. If it is another country like over here, it is not the same beast. Every country was represented by a different beast. Therefore, if it comes up at any place other than out of Europe, or out of specifically more out of Italy, out of Rome, if it doesn't come up out of Rome, then it is not the same system. Folks, do y'all realize that what really began to pull the European Union, what they once called the European Economic Community, but now they just call the European Union, that what really began to pull them together is a treaty, and that really brought them together in a unity, not as a one nation yet, but in a unity, and begin to bring this European nation together. This began in a treaty where the nations that that were first a part of it, more have come on since then, but with the initial treaty, they met in Rome, and it is called the Treaty of Rome that began this union. And they had comments and things, and in listening to Billy Brim, she brought out, he said there's been comments and things in that time about how they wanted to come back to the greatness of the Roman Empire. You see, because of 2 world wars, they believed that the reason for all these wars is because of we have all these different nations and boundaries and disagreement. But if we come together all as one nation, there won't be war anymore. We need to come back to the greatness of the Roman Empire that conquered it all as one nation. Do you see the biblical prophecy in this, folks? And this happened decades ago, over 50 years ago, folks. It began to be the same beast. It began in Rome. And that's where it began. Further treaties have been brought up to this. More nations have come into this, of course. But it began, and as you can see, by the European Union coming together, you see, then when the Antichrist comes into the power in that, he doesn't have to conquer west and north. It'll all be already together. It's already in place. Doesn't have to. That's why his expansion has to go south and east, you see. So we've got so much evidence of all of this coming together. Kind of got a little ahead of myself, but I was just excited about sharing these things. I'm looking at my time here, and my time's getting pretty close to run out. I didn't get as far as I wanted to get. But then it says south and east, but it says toward the pleasant land. The pleasant land is the only, I don't know if the green right here, I kind of put the boundaries of Israel right here. It probably doesn't show up very well, I don't know. But the pleasant land is Israel. And the Antichrist is going to come against Israel. And we're going to see it more and further explained as we go on in end-time biblical prophecy. This is the heart. You'll show, I believe it's in the next chapter, chapter 9, God said, I will show you what will happen with your people. These prophecies have to do, and his people were Israel. The prophecies have to do with Israel and God's dealings with Israel, the times of the Gentiles that Jesus referred to them as. He called them the times of, I don't like the word Gentile, but that's what we commonly understand. It's just the word for nations, you see. And for time's sake, I'm just going to go ahead and go into it. I don't have much time left anyway. You see, after the flood, God established the 70 nations in Genesis chapter 10. God established the nations, and the purpose for the nations was to establish civil government for men to administrate. But God established civil government, even though it was to be administrated by men, you see. And so all God saw people as their nations. That's why in some prophecies, especially, he'll call them Gog and Togar, Ma, and this, that, and the other. Those are the original names of the nations that came out of the original people who were the founders of those nations, who were the forefathers, if you would, of those nations. And God always saw them as the nations. So when God made covenant with Abraham, he took somebody out of the nations. Abraham gained something with God that no other nation had, and that is covenant with God. And this is what raised up Abraham and therefore all his descendants above all the other peoples of the earth, not because they were in themselves so wonderful, but because they had covenant with God. It brought them up over all the nations of the earth, and so all the nations of the earth down here were considered common then. They all just had common. They didn't have what was uncommon, and that was covenant with God. And so then, of course, in the New Testament, everything, Jesus came. He says he takes out of the nations, he takes out of Israel and makes one new man. And to where we can all now share covenant with God in common. Jesus made that common now, to have covenant with him. So we see, so when Jesus said the times of the Gentiles, he said the times of the nations. And what he's referred to the times of the nations, when Israel continued to sin against God, finally there was going to be a period of time where, even though by covenant with God they were higher than the nations, but because of how much they disobeyed God and dishonored him and so on, there was going to be a time where the nations would rule over them, when they were meant to rule over the nations because of covenant with God. But because they didn't honor God, eventually the nations now, and they will continue, the times of the Gentiles will continue until the end of the tribulation, and we go into the millennium. But the times of the Gentiles is the times of the nations, ruling over Israel, treading over the land. And the Antichrist wants the land and wants it to be his. And so people who say it has nothing to do with the land, it has everything to do with the land, folks, as well as, well, we'll get into that later. I'm getting ahead of myself again. I want to tell you everything all at once. But again, it shows us the direction in which he will go. And then in verse 10, time's gone. We'll have to take up here. We're in the interpretation, or we're in the vision of chapter 8. It continues on about that final Antichrist kingdom. In verse 10, after we transition to the 10 horns, we transition to the end time, the Antichrist's kingdom. And so that's where we're at. Keep that in mind, and we'll come back and continue from there. So I'm just thanking you once again for listening to the broadcast, trusting it's been a blessing to you and helping you to understand these things. So until next time we come together, be blessed.